So I strongly believe, from what I can see, that we are just at the surface of international law, of the history of international law. And when I see new publications such as the one of John Warlock Scott on the judgment of history of fluid jurisdiction by Nurfadila Yahaha, points us, it's just point the ocean beneath the history of international law. So the theme of our today's session is Intersectional Sovereignties, Dr. Aline Chalufour, woman at Nuremberg and at Paris, Ottawa, and Dalat. And the prosopographical approach of international law is not only Eurocentric when we look at publication, but it's also very often centered on a male white elite. And by engaging today with a gender approach to international law, and by drawing also from unarchived sources, so this session really invites us to think about a new historiography of global governance. So we are honored to have Professor Diane-Marie Aman and Dr. George Giannakopoulos with us today. So our speaker is Professor Aman. So Diane-Marie Aman holds the Emily and Ernest Woodruff Chair in International Law at the University of Georgia School of Law, and serves also as a faculty co-director of the Dean Rusk International Law Center. Besides having been a fellow in Oxford at the Max Planck Institute, at Mansfield College, also at Max Planck Institute, Luxembourg, and also at the University of South California Shoah Foundation Center. Diane was also appointed the International Criminal Court Prosecutor Special Advisor on Children and affected by armed conflict in December 2012. So our commentator is George. So George holds a PhD in modern history from Queen Mary University of London, and he is currently, among other things, an Academy of Athens postdoctoral fellow at King's College London. He had published widely on British international thought and Southeastern Europe. Recently, he edited a special issue on Britain, European civilization, and the idea of liberty. It's forthcoming in the history of European ideas. He is also currently working on two book projects. First, a history of British intellectual engagement with Southeastern Europe in the age of nationalism and internationalism, and second, a history of European intervention in modern Greece. And after, I really think that also his historiographical intervention will also provide a new understanding of European empire. So today I'm really happy about this session, drawing from France to Canada and to Vietnam or to Indochina, and revisiting also international law.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to present this work. It is, in fact, an offshoot of a larger project that I'm doing that I'll talk about in a minute. The title comes by way of invitation from a European Society of International Law meeting last fall, where there was an inquiry in sovereignty, and I was working on this project, and I realized one of the amazing things about this particular individual is her life spans the 20th century, and because of her engagement with international law and the events of the day, in fact, several different theories of sovereignty get tested out in her life experientially and also in the life of her mind, if you will. And as you said, one of the issues that we simply can't avoid because of her identity is the gendered nature of her story. And the reason that I open with this clip from the major trial, the IMT trial at Nuremberg, is to ask what you see when you look at this clip. And when I showed it at the ESIL meeting, someone, while we were waiting, said, "Oh, that's Robert Jackson." And I thought that was a fascinating statement because the only person that that individual saw in this very crowded picture was the lead prosecutor who goes to the lectern. and notably mistook Roman Rudenko, the chief Russian prosecutor, for the American Robert Jackson. And so that tells us we have an understanding of Nuremberg that is not only white and male, but in many ways white, male, and Anglo-American.
Yeah.
And beyond that, of course, if we want to take off one of the veils of invisibility, the person that I'm interested in this picture is the woman with dark hair who is entering at the side, and you see that someone actually makes room for her at the French prosecution table. And for me, both the fact that we don't see her until we're told to look at her, and the fact that literally she has a place at the table are important ways to think about her status at this particular event. Let me tell you a little bit about who she was by showing you now a different picture of the Nuremberg courtroom. This is a standard panoramic picture of the courtroom, probably early in the trial. This, in fact, is Robert Jackson. And he's seated watching Thomas Dodd, who was one of his top deputy prosecutors, present to the court. And if we look at this quickly, we see a grayscale white male presentation, which is about what the story of Nuremberg would tell us to expect in the actual courtroom. But if we look a little closer, we discover that each one of these red circles contains a woman. And that begins to tell us that although they may not have been visible, perhaps because we were not looking for them, perhaps because many of them in the norm of that time and place are in uniform. I should note that not all of them are service members, but for ease of wardrobe, if you will, they were permitted to wear uniforms and often did. And for the women in particular, it was a protective measure against being mistreated. If they were assumed to be service members, they might be a little bit more protected than otherwise. But we see here lawyers, we see translators, we see secretaries, we see lots of journalists and other administrators. And so that should again give us a visual of this idea that there were women at Nuremberg. Now, the book I'm writing is going to explore quite a lot of the people, particularly the people in the front. But the person that we're going to talk about today is this one right here, Aline Chalufour. And the reason that I have spun off an article about her in particular is she's just a fascinating character who is largely unknown even in her own country. And so let me try to take you on a 100-year story about her as quickly as I can. She was born in 1899 into a French bourgeois family. There are only 6 of the 8 children in the family shown in the picture at top, which was taken about 1909. Probably fittingly, she is the one right here at about age 9 or 10 at this point, and she is the one reading the book. The family was incredibly well educated. There's probably 3 or 4 Harvard degrees among them. There were several boys in the family who are not pictured, which explains the Harvard degrees. She herself would study at Smith and other places. But she was, by the accounts of her family, the intellectual in a very highly educated family. The other thing to say about this family is they were very Catholic. This is a picture, of course, much later. This is Chalufour, maybe about, I don't know, let's say 50 years old. Excuse me. This is the Abbé Klein. It's Sunday dinner in the family garden. And my understanding is that he was a constant, almost member of the family. And so the fact that they are well educated and Catholic is part of their identity. The paper that you have looked at opens with an account of one of the lectures at the Hague Academy of 1937. And this particular lecture is by a Zagreb professor named George Andrassy, who gives an account of sovereignty that is very much in keeping with one strain of doctrine at this time. These are the interwar years. And what he does is he says there used to be this idea of absolute sovereignty, l'état c'est moi, the king. There are those who say there is no sovereignty, that only international institutions like the League of Nations matter anymore. They are sovereign, sort of a world government notion. He strikes a middle line and talks about multiple sovereignties, that states still are sovereign, but they must interact and coexist not only with each other, but also with international organizations like the League. And then he says two things that are very important and interesting, I think. One is he declares that law is sovereign over states. And he refers both to national and international law. And so that's a really interesting and powerful statement. And the other thing that I think is very interesting with regard to Chalufour is that he says that states are powerless against some forces. That no, even when they're sovereign, it's not only that they must coexist with each other, but they are powerless against social forces, religious forces, and economic forces. And that, we'll see, is important for her story as well. So now you're saying, why are you telling me about him when this is a story about her? Well, it's because, as you see from the postcard it writes, she in fact attended that lecture. And she writes that to her brother that she has attended the 1937 Hague lecture and finds the lectures very interesting, as well as, quote, the contacts that one makes there. And so we see someone who is a networker, and then as now, people go to places like the Hague Academy to become part of that community. She is not going there as a mere onlooker. If you see the picture at left, this is her dissertation from 1927. By my count, she is the 6th woman in the history of the University of Paris to receive a PhD in international law. And I believe the 34th woman to receive a doctorate in any field from the University of Paris. So she's truly a pioneer. The line here that this is a dry and complex subject is the line that is given in the book review of her published dissertation. Interesting that her dissertation merits publication. Interesting that it merits a book review in a leading journal written by a senior member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You see that the president of her jury is Jules Badevant, who goes on to be the president of the International Court of Justice. Her subject is, in fact, very complex and very dry. It is status of forces agreements during World War I. But what does that tell us about this area? She is part of the interwar years. She had spent time and, in fact, was a graduate student lecturer at the League of Nations for various professors, was involved in the work of the League, both in that capacity and in her role as a suffragist and feminist activist in the interwar years. And you see here, she is an author and a member of the board of something called the Union for Women's Vote, a liberal Catholic feminist group. So more conservative than the more famous radical feminist French group, but still quite progressive for the time. And she is writing constantly. You see she's identified as a member of the Bar of Paris. She practices for about 10 years in the 30s before the bar, and she is a feminist activist at the same time. Now, one of the things that was interesting about Andrassi's lecture is, of course, you remember that he says social forces are something the state is powerless against. And so one of the things that I explore in the paper is her activism as a member of civil society against the state, because in fact, France does not give women the vote until after World War II. And so there's a lot there. I should say she has probably published 36 publications on public affairs in the course of her life. So there's a lot of material there. The other thing that happens is Andrassy totally omits any discussion of colonialism, which is remarkable for a lecture in 1937 that purports to be progressive. It's also interesting that when he refers to multiple sovereignties, he does so through this quote from A Descent in the Lotus case, which refers to international law as being sovereign, not only sovereign, but in fact imperial. And I talk about that a little bit, but I use it here to segue into the next part of her life. The very same ship company that had the Lotus in its fleet appears to be the company that has the ship that she sails from Marseille through the Suez Canal and onwards to what is now Vietnam. And so for about 5 years, she is both a colonial subaltern and succeeding that, a refugee. She goes to what is now Vietnam to become a colonial school teacher. This appears to be because of the Depression. It would not surprise anyone that women were not being hired very much, retained to practice, even if they were members of the Paris Bar. Much of the time she was doing translations for money, doing lectures for money, teaching on the side for money. She and her sister ran a boarding school in Paris. And eventually she decides to go to this new city called Dalat, where, as you see here, it's just like in France, but with more opportunities. This is a quote from her letter to her family. And the postmark here repeats that. It says, Dalat, climate of France in Indochina. And so they were really selling this colonial recreation of Europe in this mile-high mountain refuge city. She works at a convent school that was founded by the Paris-educated Empress of Annam, which was what that region of Vietnam was then called. It had only been open 1 or 2 years when she got there. It is a cloistered life for a woman who is now 40 years old, who has never married, and is Catholic but not a nun, and qualified as a liberal Catholic, whatever that meant for the time. So imagine someone who's highly educated. She's lived in North America. She's lived in many places throughout Europe. She's been a member of the bar. And now she finds herself as a colonial school teacher, living in a convent. She's homesick. She's interested in things, fascinated by things like the tiger who roams the grounds at night. She's very jaundiced about the people there when she arrives, and she makes pretty arch comments about the colonials and how narrow-minded they are. And what saves her is getting papers from France and magazines to find out what's happening in the world. She also does lecture tours and lectures in Cambodia, Bangkok, what is now Jakarta, Shanghai. She does broadcasts for Saigon Radio. And so she's very involved in things, but again, a single woman living alone in sort of a dead-end job on a 1-year contract. The last year that she's there is the year that Japan takes over, and she tries very hard to get out. France has fallen. Japan has taken over and cut a deal with Vichy to control Vietnam. She can't get out, and so she ends up spending her last year living in the villa of the family that owns this plantation, a sugar plantation, still teaching at a different school, but working at night as the nanny for their daughter in order not to have to live in the convent anymore. She seems over time to become more comfortable with colonialism. And I suppose that's not a surprise. She starts complaining about her Indonesian maid not doing the work well enough. She starts reveling in the nice dinners and things like that. At the same time, she remains very aware of the colonial situation, to the point that when she gets out of the area and begins lecturing, she is speaking of the colonized people and trying to make arguments to the people to whom she's lecturing about their affinity with the French over the Japanese, right? So she's aware that they are colonized, but sort of buys into the imperial civilizing mission that France is still a much better deal for them, right? She finds herself eventually in Canada, and this is a really interesting turn of events. She begins working for what called themselves the Fighting French, the Gaullist movement. They're headquartered in Ottawa, but she spends a lot of time trying to convince the Québécois to support de Gaulle and not Vichy. They were mostly Vichyists. She undertakes an extraordinary lecture tour from Ottawa all the way to Vancouver and back by train, lecturing on behalf of de Gaulle. And so this is a picture of some of the headlines. There's probably 45 articles that I have found quoting her lectures. And what's interesting about them is that she is presenting a view of sovereignty by which is really complex, and I have not yet developed it in the paper, but this headline of one of the lectures, The Lawlessness of the Present Regime in France, gives you an idea of it. And I found another quote when I was looking through my notes. At one point in the lecture, she says, when de Gaulle talks, he talks in the name of 42 million shackled people. And so her colonial experience has her talking about the occupation of France as if France were subjugated, colonized, etc. And so she has a certain emotion about it that I suspect would not be there had she not been in the colonial space. She argues, as did the Gaullists in general, that the real France, the sovereign France, is the Fighting French France, and that the Vichy are lawless, and from an international law standpoint, the sovereign state remains the state in exile, the state in resistance, which is a fascinating solution to the problem of what is Vichy, right? I will stop there and just leave you with those moments for thought, because I want to talk about a couple of other things. So the last piece that I want to talk about is the last part of her life. Remember the quote about how arid and dry the subject was of her dissertation? I didn't finish the sentence. The sentence finished, for a woman. And so that's a reminder for us that throughout her life, she's incredibly well-educated, intellectual, fully engaged with these, the events of the world, both at an intellectual and an experiential level. But the men that she's working with never forget she's a woman, right? And so she's constantly working with that. And there are a number of theories that I'm playing with in this regard. I am not going to go into them right now. In fact, I didn't really finish that piece of the paper I gave you. I'm not sure what fits and what is proper for me to discuss, given that we're talking about the 1940s and some of these theories developed much later. So I haven't really figured that piece out. But let me just tell you very quickly about what happened to her in this period, and then I'll quit. She makes her way back to Paris by way of Algeria. She finally gets the call to go work for de Gaulle in Algeria, which was what everyone in Canada wanted to do. It takes her so long to get there that by the time she gets there, Paris has been liberated and de Gaulle has flown back to Paris, and then she's stuck in Algeria for two months trying to get out. She makes her way back to Paris and was one of the war crimes investigators for the Ministry of Justice. So she is developing the evidence in the most immediate way in 1945, leading up to the Nuremberg trials. What does that mean? She's talking to detainees as they arrive in Paris about their experience in taking witness statements day in, day out. And you see her comment to her family, this is grim but useful work. At the same time, interestingly enough, she's writing for a women's magazine that is feminist in its outlook. So these dual identities remain. The result of her work is not only that she ends up at Nuremberg, but that she is the person who both first met and developed the evidence of Francesc Boix, which was the photographs that had been smuggled out of the Mauthausen camp, which were really important evidence at the trial. You see her here. Women were never permitted to speak at the trial, but the women who really worked very hard were permitted to sit at the table next to the deputy prosecutor, who in many cases read the brief that they had written or that they had certainly collaborated on. And so this is a show of her importance. She ends up getting an appointment in her own right as a French prosecutor at the Ravensbrück trial, again, a camp where she had developed a significant amount of evidence. But note that she is given that on the condition that she not speak in court. She is the only French prosecutor, but the condition of her appointment is that she be a prosecutor without right of audience. Think about what that meant. My guess is that it might very well be possible it's part of the reason why she's appointed. I can't imagine that any of the men would have accepted that condition on their work. Nevertheless, it is a significant appointment. She ends up being the editor of the 42-volume Nuremberg proceedings in the French edition. This is not what she wanted to do. She applied to be a judge immediately from Nuremberg. She was denied. It is not till 1949 that she becomes a judge at age 50, and then she serves until 1966. This is a picture of her in this period, and you see that in fact in 1957, and I will close here, she returns to The Hague, again attends the Hague Academy, and publishes her thoughts about Nuremberg. So I have much more to say, but I've gone over time, and I'm going to stop there and welcome George's comments.
Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. Thank you, Diane, for an excellent paper and the opportunity to read this. I will speak for 5 minutes, just raise a couple of points, and then open the discussion. At first I should say that I come at this as somewhat of an interloper. I'm by no means a historian of legal thought, and I'm still learning my way around the critical literature on sovereignty for my work in Greece, on Greece and interventions. I do have an active interest, though, on the entangled relations between nationalism, internationalism, and empire in the period covered by the paper. So what I want to do is just want to make 3 points addressing wider methodological and maybe more particular issues raised in the paper, and also give Diane the opportunity to elaborate further on aspects of her story, which is really fascinating. Now, point 1, I'd call it writing women back in the history of legal and international thought, more widely international thought. How do we do this? How do we understand the exclusion of female scholars from the canon? In the particular case study, what's also interesting is there's also another layer of exclusion, and that is from the legal profession as such, as you mentioned. But to state the broader picture, is these kinds of exclusions only a matter of paternalism and patriarchy in the field of legal thought, for instance? Or is there something more to be said about maybe the alternative sides through which female scholars and in which female scholars operated? I was really glad to see references in the paper to colleagues here in the University of Sussex working on women in international thought. And there's a recent paper out in Modern Intellectual History on the professions and the role of professions in recovering women's voices in international thought. And I think this set of questions applies to legal thought as well, and to your case study most prominently. I think the paper gestures to the latter, to this question of, what kind of sites do we need to recover to understand and to see, legal thought in operation? I think your paper gestures to this when referring to Chalufour's work as an educator in Indonesia. And I was wondering if you have any more thoughts on that. The final point I want to make on this broader cluster of women and legal thought is an anecdote. An anecdotal thing I came across a few months ago. I was reading Lucy Mayer's, who's also a very interesting British case. Lucy and her work on minorities, one of her first people working on the minority question in Britain in the 20s. And she published in 26, 27, I think, a piece on the minority question. And what's interesting there, that in order for that piece, for that book to, achieve a certain standing, Gilbert Murray, who a leading League internationalist, who was also her boss in a way, had to write a very patronizing introduction. And effectively, the tone of the introduction towards the end is pretty much, she's been my assistant, and that way, what she says has bear a certain credence. So there's a piece in your paper where you kind of, talk about the way her PhD was reviewed. So that reminded me of this. It's actually a perfect analogy. Now, I want to move to a second methodological point. I really appreciate the effort to integrate in the narrative and in our historical reconstructions, biological elements and neglected sources, postcards and photographs. What do we look when we see a photograph? This is something I also try to do in my own work, and I'm grappling with this at the moment. And I'm very sympathetic with the idea that there is a non-deterministic link to be recovered between individual experiences and, on the other hand, abstract theorizations. And I'd really love you if you could, I'd really like it if you could expand on this further. For instance, how did her engagement with link internationalism, her feminism, her imperialist dispositions influence the development of her legal thought? For instance, were there any shifts in the way she understood certain legal concepts with sovereignty before she goes to Indonesia and after that? Is there anything more we can tease out, even from references to sovereignty in a more colloquial way in her writings? So that would be sort of another cluster of questions. And the final point I want to make, it's this super fascinating idea of intersectional sovereignties. And you refer at the start of the paper to these three, the way I understand them, three parallel registers. The permutations of sovereignty in the evolving interwar international system, the question of sovereignty in the colonial world, and the challenges, obviously, and something like, maybe I'm making it up, or you had it in the paper, corporeal sovereignty. And that's quite interesting because it also brings in a bodily dimension to that, which is fascinating. So you end the paper with a rather bold proposition, inviting us to see Chalufour as a subaltern. And this final proposition, and also these ideas about corporeal sovereignty and stuff, remain a bit underdeveloped, and I understand you're now working through them. So I'd be really keen if you could expand on this and see how these and share some further thoughts on how these registers can be analyzed in parallel, because I think that's truly fascinating. And I have other smaller points to do, especially with your discussion about Andrassy and the critical literature on sovereignty, like Angie and Benton, but I'll just leave them maybe for the discussion if someone picks up on them. So again, thank you very much for the paper.
I'm glad that you found a lot in there that's interesting. I think the question of writing women in is quite a challenge, and in fact, I've tried it a number of different ways. Not only with this project so much, but with the book itself, which will be on the various women at Nuremberg. There's the Add Women and Stir option, which is simply saying, oh, there's the woman in the picture, let me tell you what she did. I find that pretty unsatisfying. And I'm very happy that through my research, I found enough through personal papers in particular. There is an idea called Add Women and Stir, which simply says, let me now put a woman in the picture and tell you the same story all over again. I find that very unsatisfying. There was a time when I thought that's all I would have to say about these people because they aren't credited in the official record. And so I have had to go through all kinds of personal papers, some of which are in archives and ignored, others of which I have found through contacts with families. I have, as you can see, voluminous information from her. It turns out her nephew, who must be in his 70s himself at this point, is a retired Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker who totally gets the project, and he has shared with me everything. He happens also to be the nephew who got the trunks and trunks of letters and things like that. So he's been invaluable. From a British family, I have a daily journal, a daily diary with 2 pages handwritten entries day after day at the IMT of a British intelligence officer, a woman who had worked at the trial. And so those are allowing me to tell a genuine story. The challenge then becomes a challenge of simply retelling what happened in a certain time and place through the words of these individuals, without really prejudging how much it's going to change the story. I think it will change it significantly, in part because, and this goes to the subaltern issue, the subalterns, by which I mean subordinates, and they were both male and female, they didn't have to adhere to the party line. And so what they said happened, what they found interesting, particularly in their private papers, in their conversations with each other, even in oral histories they did in the 90s, were much less varnished and more candid than what you get from some of the higher ups. And so you get much more conversation, for instance, about whether the Cold War was the reason the Nuremberg Project ended. What the attitude was at the court community about Jewish people after the war. Things that kind of weren't said at the higher ups, you get more information about that. You probably get less about gender than you would expect, but that may not be surprising because in many ways they were trying to make the men forget they were women, right? Because they were trying to hold themselves out as professionals. And, you know, I've had the question before, did they care more about sexual abuse than the men in the camps or whatever? My guess is that even if they did, it wouldn't have been profitable to put that forward because it's a way of reminding the men that they're women, right? And that they care about different things. And in fact, Chalufour talks about aggression. When she talks about the camps, her complaint about the Ravensbrück trial is that the British were going for the easy to prove crimes, the really gross atrocities, and not looking at the attack on the political system of France by detaining and torturing members of the resistance. And so she saw it through a political lens more than what we might call the crimes against humanity, atrocity crimes lens in some of the stuff she wrote. So there's a lot there. I'm going to let them tell the story, and I'm not going to try to prejudge what that says. And as you can tell, I've got far too much information to spend a lot of time comparing and contrasting with lots of other stuff. One of the challenges for me is that nobody knows these people's stories, and yet I have an obligation both to tell the story and to try to interpret it in something less than a 42-volume series, right? So I'm grappling with that as well. How do women get published? So one of the fascinating things is that she is unique in the extent of her publication among all the Nuremberg women that I've looked at. There are only, to my knowledge, 2 book-length published memoirs by any woman who worked at Nuremberg. One of them is a simultaneous interpreter who's Russian, who published her memoir during the Yeltsin era. She had to wait that long to find a safe moment to talk about Nuremberg. Her family was in the Gulag while she was at Nuremberg. They were dissidents. It has only been published in German, and that only recently in the last 6 years. And so for anyone who doesn't have Russian or German, it's unavailable in effect. And the only other one is by a woman who is a court reporter at the doctor's trial, an American who has written about that experience. Neither of them have major publishers. And so my question, and as you know, there were many, many male memoirs. So the question is, why is that? It may be because they were scared. They didn't feel they had access. They didn't know how to do it. They went home, they got married and had kids and didn't have time to do it. It would not surprise me to find a memoir written that could not get published. And in fact, many of them end up, there are some others, some newspaper reporters and things who wrote memoirs with, say, a chapter on their Nuremberg experience. They're almost all almost self-published or very, very tiny presses, right? So access is really important. Chalufour has Badavant as the president of her jury. She gets a degree from Sciences Po. She teaches at Smith, Toronto, Bryn Mawr, Milton Academy. Her brother-in-law is a fellow named Howard Rice, who was a famous professor and head of the library at Princeton. And in fact, I think still today, is the author of one of the leading biographies of Jefferson in Paris. And that contact was extremely important, I think, for her, as well as other names that flowed in and out. One of her close family friends was a man named Robert Guillon, I'm not sure how the last name is pronounced, who was the Le Monde reporter in Tokyo, and the family were very involved. Her patron / colleague in the women's movement is the Duchesse de la Rochefoucauld, who is an aristocrat and very connected. She is in some articles described, perhaps as exaggeration, perhaps not. I haven't been able to document this, but there are articles that describe her as a close personal friend of Charles de Gaulle. Her Gaullist connections was what got her the judgeship. She's the 20th woman in France ever to become a judge. And I know that, or I suspect that, because there are administrative records that note she is from a very Gaullist family in her application. Her sister was three sisters actually were decorated at various levels for their work for the resistance, including her. One of her sisters was quite involved in the resistance in a very active way. And so, yes, connections mattered in a major way. Last thing I want to address is the linkage between non-deterministic evidence and abstract theorization. I'm fairly confident with the Hague Academy discussion because I know that she was there. Actually, Hirsch Lauderpacht did the general course that year. And her activities in the League, she also was a research assistant for Manlio Hudson. She was clearly very much part of that intellectual current. There is enough in what I've seen about colonialism. She talks in her letters from Dalat about the books she's reading. She muses about things. Lectures she gave in Jakarta were published in the Batavia newspaper, etc., that I think I can tease out a story about colonialism. And as I suggested, I'm fascinated with this notion of certainly blind spots about the nature of colonialism in what's now Vietnam, and yet this embrace of an understanding of being a subjugated person, which, as I understand it, and I'm not a French historian, is a central paradox of Gaullism, right? That they wanted not only to maintain French sovereignty, but to persuade Churchill and Roosevelt and eventually Truman that meant the French Empire, right? That they got to keep the empire, right? So they're talking about freedom, etc., but maintaining an imperialism. And she appears to be she's not dumb about colonialism, but she's not intolerant of it either, I think is the way that I would put it. The feminist piece, or the last piece, which gets more corporeal, Some of the stuff I didn't give you in the paper looks more like a math project because I've been reading a lot of Kristeva. And I'm just not sure how much of that is too much to say and to, if you will, layer onto this particular individual. That said, she writes letters about Freud and Jung and what she thinks about their thinking. It's clear that she's been reading that. And is it Guillaume or is it you that gave me the information about her demotion? No, I think it's Matthias Gemalich, who has written a book about jurists who discovered in her dossier that she was demoted as a judge. Then as now, you start in a small place and you try to work your way up to Paris, right? And at some point she goes from a relatively large city and she is sent back to a much smaller place. And the documentation suggests that the superior male juvenile court judges were not happy about her insertion of modernist ideas about how to treat children into her judicial behavior. And so it suggests to me that some of that, at least as it relates to sort of Freudian psychology and sovereignty, which is where Kristeva and many others at base come from, is not irrelevant. But I think some of what I've thought through doesn't belong in this paper. So I'll leave it there because I don't want to keep anyone else from asking questions.
I could maybe, I have some ideas. I would very much like to ask. I'm very interested in networks, and I was really intrigued by your wonderful presentation and the long lines you're drawing. And I was wondering whether the activism in the women movement in the 20s and 30s maybe paves the way also for engagement for the Gaullist cause in Canada, because I noticed only from the advertisements you were showing us that she's speaking in women's clubs and the like. So maybe she has presented herself as an old, let's say, sister, and then is speaking on her new subject, which is the political let's say, weight of Free France in the New World Order, because this is a bit her mission, it seems. And I also wanted to ask, this is just an idea, but I also wanted to ask whether you think that going to Nuremberg was a kind of reward from de Gaulle maybe for her, or how did she get there, or was it her old legal friends who who arranged a seat for her at the table, as you showed to us in this short video clip. So these are my two thoughts. And maybe going back on sovereignty, I also know the lecture of George Andrassy, but I think Andrassy is not, for European listeners, he's not a surprise. And it's not a surprise he's not mentioning colonialism, because this is absolutely out of every cosmos in what was it, 37. So it's absolutely no topic at that time. So he's more concerned in this issue of everybody has multiple identities and the Catholicism and all this. So maybe that was the angle which was appealing to her at that point. So thank you very much. And yeah, I would like to hear more about the road to Nuremberg, obviously.
Yes, absolutely. So let me start with Nuremberg first. Well, they're related. She finally manages to get a ticket. The reason she couldn't get out of Indochina after France fell in 1941, and remember, her life is organized around teaching contracts. So the academic year ends and she's essentially got the summer to try to get out. And she can't get a visa because there, then as now, lots of bureaucracies weren't operating. She simply cannot get literally a way to get out to another country that will take her in the time that it's required. The Princeton brother-in-law is working his networks in the US to try to get her a US visa so she can sail to the United States. but they can't get it processed in time for her not to feel that it's going to take so long that she needs to take another teaching contract. And so that's how she ends up in that final teaching job for the academic year. And she, in fact, I think may have left before the school year was entirely out. She talks about sneaking away in the full moon when no one would know that she was gone. And so apparently they wake up the next day and discover the teacher has left. She's taken a train to Saigon. Excuse me. She goes from Saigon to Yokohama, and then on to Honolulu, and then to San Francisco. And when she arrives in San Francisco, you're absolutely right. She has tried already to organize something from afar, but not successfully. When she gets to San Francisco, she stays at the Berkeley Women's Club at the University of California and begins doing a lecture tour in California, Mills College, etc. And she's invited to lecture at pretty high-level conferences about public affairs. And she is styled as the expert on what's happening in French Indochina. And so many of her lectures in this period are trying to, remember this is before Pearl Harbor, trying to get individuals in the United States concerned about Japan, trying to get them to enter the war. She is also the networks would have been the American Association of University Women, Alliance Française. She was involved in the International Women's Conference at The Hague. The suffragist movement continues because the vote wasn't gotten until after the war, and so those connections remain as well. And she is contacting all of them. In Indochina, she was also a colleague of a woman named Suzanne Karpeles, whom I understand to be a very important figure in education in Cambodia. And so she's working all of those and manages to get the position in Ottawa, working for a woman named Elisabeth de Miribel, whose father had been a leading general in World War I. And Miribel gets the call to Algiers a year before Chalufour does. And so she's a propagandist. She is making these speeches. She also is maintaining contacts with the Bar of Ottawa and holding herself out as a lawyer. She's reminding people that she has that identity. Most of her shipping passenger lists refer to her as an attorney or a barrister or something like that. And so what's interesting about the call to Algiers is not only that she gets it, but she's hired by the Ministry of Justice. So she's able to transform herself not only to get to the center of Gaullist France, but also in making that journey to become a lawyer again. And so she's hired as a lawyer. She works as a lawyer investigator in that period, 1945, leading up to Nuremberg, where she's interviewing these camp detainees and gathering the evidence, etc. And so reward possibly, but also perhaps a necessity because she knows the evidence in a way that nobody else does. She has talked to these people individually. Francesque Boix comes with the negatives that had been smuggled out. She's the first person to see the negatives of the camp. And so she's tactically involved in the evidence. She is not referred to as a lawyer. Not one woman at the International Military Tribunal who had legal credentials was qualified as a lawyer by job title. Her title is chargée de mission. And it is only at Ravensbrück where she is given the actual title of being a lawyer. So that's my response.
Hello. Sorry. I am Elise and I'm studying at the EHESS and at University of Heidelberg, and I'm doing my master's in history. And I wanted to ask a question because you mentioned that Chalufour had contacts with other French women in Indochina. So I wondered if if her implication in feminist or women's movement also continued during the time she spent in Indochina, and what was her vision of the Indo-Chinese women, also because you talked about her vision of colonialism, and if you could find in her writings any evidence of imperial feminism or things related. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Elise.
Thank you for the question. I believe that my best guess is that many of the lectures that she does are organized by women, because that is what her network is. And so when she goes to what was then called Batavia, now Jakarta, and gives lectures, she's probably doing it at the invitation of a woman who happens to be the administrator at Alliance Française. Excuse me. Many of these women are single. This is true of women in the Nuremberg era in general. Those of you who are familiar with English history may know there was a formal marriage bar. And so if you wanted to do any kind of work in diplomacy or things like that, you could not marry, period. And so it took a certain amount of courage and self-sacrifice, if you will, to decide to be a professional woman in this period. I should say that there were 4 girls in her family, only one sister ever marries, which is quite a remarkable statement. I've asked the nephew about that, and he attributes it to the fact that all the men were killed in World War I. They happened to be of that age. And he said, you know, that if you look at the statistics, the loss of men in that age group from World War I, when she would have been, what, 14 to 18, was extraordinary. And he said, if you add the fact that all of them had postgraduate degrees, the chances of a woman like that finding a mate were quite low. Some of the women at Nuremberg certainly were gay. I have no evidence to that effect about her. In fact, I have some personal evidence to the contrary that I'm not really ready to make public yet. But I think it was more in the nature of what it meant to be a professional woman in this time. So yes, that means that her contacts were with other women. Karpeles is the only one that I have heard by name. And I've been in touch, there's a woman named Joyce Goodman who is a professor of colonial education at one of the universities in Britain. And this is an entirely different network of historians. And she was very excited about this particular individual. She was apparently a very central figure in that. What were Chalufour's views? She is still thinking about feminist issues. Some of the lectures she did, and this isn't surprising, if you're doing lecture tours for money, you're going to talk about whatever you can that people might be interested in. And you might even do 3 lectures a day on 3 different subjects before 3 different audiences. And she did. I mean, you see her going from high schools to women's clubs to the Bar Association, etc. So one of her stump speeches, if you will, was about French women and the status of women in France and the gains that they were making in becoming members of public life. And so that suggests to me, although I don't have evidence, because of course my personal papers are her letters to her family. And so I only know about Karpeles because she mentions her to her family. I don't have what I'm sure was correspondence between her and Karpeles. I don't have access to that. I would assume she was within that space. I have found no evidence that she was sympathetic to the status of colonized women in those periods. And as I say, the letter where she talks about her lazy maid suggests to me that she was not very much attuned to that. I'll also say that when she tries to make her way back to America, get out of Asia, as I said, she goes through Yokohama, and it's a hilarious story. The consul general in Yokohama decides she's enough of a dignitary that they assign one of their aides to give her a quick tour of the region, like a one-day tour before her ship sails in the evening. And they go to Kyoto to the temples, and it's beautiful. And they get back to port only to watch the ship sailing out of harbor. And so she's literally missed the boat. And she gets stuck in Japan for another month before she can get a trip back. In that period, she stays with the Le Monde reporter whom I mentioned, and he takes her all around Tokyo, which is fascinating in itself, because of course this is Japanese occupied Tokyo, or Japanese imperialist Tokyo, if you will. And she is not very sympathetic about the status of geishas either. She sort of talks about them in a very, oh, isn't this interesting kind of way, right? It's sort of, you almost feel like she's repeating the way that the men at the table where they went to this restaurant where they were served by geishas, sort of repeating what others had said, right? Now, does that mean that she was racist and never had any sympathy with other women? I don't think so. I think it was, as much as anything, reflective of a certain time and place and situation. And that one of the things that we would expect from someone who lived 91, 92 years is that she evolved over time in many ways, and she adjusted to experiences. And I will note that the Le Monde reporter with whom she stayed, who took her to see the geishas, ends up after the war writing a tract in French that demands the liberation of the geishas and is very much discussing their exploitation and how bad this institution is. And so my guess is that he was probably the one saying some of the things she parrots in the letter, which were not very sympathetic, but that he lived through Hiroshima, he lived through the bombing of Japan, etc. His views have changed on things. And so it would not at all surprise me that his evolution and her evolution, they may have, ideas may have changed about things. But she is a product of her class. She's not an aristocrat, but it was not, it was a fairly successful bourgeois family, at least until the father died. There's a lot of financial precarity after that. But highly educated. When she lands at Honolulu on her journey home, she is the only woman interviewed and quoted in the newspaper article about all of these refugees from Asia who have made it to Honolulu and on their way back. So she carries the status of being a lawyer and also having impeccable English in addition to French. English was as much a ticket to status as anything in this period. And she uses that to significant benefit throughout her career.
I think, thank you, Diane. Guillaume, you have one question, and just after Guillaume asks his question, I will add my set of questions. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, Guillaume.
So, thank you for this very interesting and fascinating presentation on Anne Chalufour. I was, I had also some interest in this person in my research on Nuremberg, because in the beginning of my research, I made an investigation on the French team in Nuremberg, and this lawyer retained my interest. I find especially fascinating what you say about the feminist dimension and maybe anti-colonialist dimension of Anne Chalufour. And it is somewhat for me contrasting with her late statement on Nuremberg, which I read. She wrote some articles in Le Monde and other newspapers in the 70s, which were rather apologetic to on Nuremberg. It was a defense of the work of the French work at Nuremberg in a classical term. My question, I have two questions. The first one is concerning her contact with Jules Badevant, the French professor who was the president of the PhD jury. Does she also had contact to Badevant's daughter, Suzanne Bastide, who was also active in Nuremberg? She was the first French professor of law in the French history, getting a position in 1932, I think. And she played an important, significant role in the development of international law. And the second question is concerning the hesitation maybe in Anne Chalufour's career path between the academic career on one side and the legal practical career on the other side. One can consider that she had maybe the possibility to follow academic career, but in the end, she was a judge for children at the beginning of the 1950s. Which was a rather low position in the French judiciary. And I want to know if she had the intention to follow after her PhD academic career or not. It's an open question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Guillaume Moralis. I will add my questions and then we will finish. I have so first I have one comment. So it's about the historiography of the French participation at the Nuremberg trial. There is no publication in English about the French at the Nuremberg. There were two theses which had been written. One is in French and the other so it's by Antonin Tisseron, and the other is by Matthias Gemelich, and it is in German. So the French participation at the Nuremberg trial is it's unknown completely. And Guillaume Moralis has also worked, and as a background, we know. So Kirsten von Lingen contacted me because she knew that Diane needed help for her research, and then Diane contacted Guillaume because I told her Guillaume is working on the Nuremberg trial, and then we get in contact, everyone is together. And it's good that you have also collaborated with Matthias, because Matthias Gemelich is also very helpful. So this kind of networks which are very helpful for the small group of people working on the French jurists. So it's only as a background information to explain the context. And so I would have 4 different questions. So the first of all is it's more general questions. It's so what can a gender approach to international law tell us? So and we can also ask which role have played women's club during World War II in the understand and in the aftermath of World War II in the reconceptualization of international law. So this is my first question. So second question, why, so you said that, and I agree with you, so the historiography is dominated by the Anglo-Saxon publications, but why is the French historiography on all these trials forgotten, and what can it tell us about international law? Then third question, when you speak about sovereignty, you mentioned that she participated in this conference in 1936-7, then she's going to Indochina, and then at the Nuremberg trial. How, and you mentioned also, so you analyze it also, her understanding of sovereignty are through Benton and Ng, but how can it, how did her perception of sovereignty evolve through the time? So it's and what can also the theoretical framework defined by Benton and Ng tell us about the evolution of her perception of sovereignty? And the last question would be on the materials you are working for. You are working on letters and postcards. What can letters and postcards, this material, tell us about the global history of international law? So yeah, that's my fourth question.
Oh, this is so easy. No, I'm just teasing. Thank you for those questions. So, Guillaume, I really appreciate your reminder about Suzanne Badevant Bastide. She also received her doctorate from the University of Paris in international law. I don't think it was humanitarian law. I think it was more public international law.
Yeah, international law.
3 years later, right? So she is maybe 5 years younger than Chalufour, and 3 years later in her doctorate, I suspect that discrepancy is because Chalufour went and taught at Smith in Toronto and things. It's not, she didn't start law immediately after her undergraduate degree. I think that Suzanne Bastide is the example of Kirsten's question about what, or was it George who was talking about the person who was published because her patron wrote the foreword. Bastide is given the first academic position in law for a woman immediately after her dissertation is published. She is the first woman to be elected to the Académie Française. She is not the first woman to have applied, and in fact, the Duchesse de la Rochefoucauld, in her memoir, is quite snippy about the fact that Bastide was elected when the Duchess had applied first and was rejected by 1 vote. And she flat out says it was her connections. Not only was her father famous and a member of the Academy, but so was her husband. Not to say she wasn't an incredibly talented person. She's also the first woman ever to serve at the International Court of Justice, although as an ad hoc judge. But I think she is the marker that the more status that you had, the more possible it was to do extraordinary things. Her role at Nuremberg is much less than Chalufour's. My understanding is that she assisted in the preparation of the opening speech of the chief prosecutor. It is not clear to me that she even attended a courtroom proceeding. She also was not the only drafter of that speech. It is her role there is not mentioned in any of her official obituaries, so that the family did not think it was a significant enough contribution to mention. And the chief prosecutor, François de Menton, quits within 3 or 4 days after giving that speech so he can go back to Paris and run for office. And so my guess is that that had something to do with the cutoff as well. So Chalufour is certainly the only woman on duty, if you will, in the courtroom at Nuremberg. I have tried to reach out to the family. They have not responded, even though I was referred by colleagues that knew them and vouched for me. And so I don't know. There is one reference in Chalufour's letters. I should say that the year before she finally goes to Indochina, she writes her brother, her favorite brother was the youngest brother who had emigrated to the US. And she writes him as the big sister to the little brother. And they write long letters between each other because they had that affinity that siblings sometimes have. And she mentions to him, by that time she was teaching full-time in Paris, by her quote, to 14 brats who are very hot and don't want to be here, and so am I, and so do I not want to be here. And she says that she misses very much going to the Palais de Justice. She misses wearing the robe. In that conversation, she refers to the death of Jules Badevant's son, which is almost never mentioned in the official biographies. And so she clearly, either personally or through her community, is very attuned to and speaks of it in the way that you might, the professor who you were very fond of, who was a mentor, right? So I think there's a connection, but it may not have gone beyond that. The Badevants were Protestant, and so that might be a reason that there were no social interactions between those two families. As for the judiciary, and I do not know whether she attempted an academic life, but I would imagine in 1927, it would not have seemed possible. And perhaps going to women's colleges in the United States like Smith and Bryn Mawr was an effort to become established, although they were more in the nature of sort of graduate student exchanges. I found nothing where she says, I'm doing this because I hope I can get a position at one of these schools. It would not surprise me that was in her mind, but there's nothing that I've found that confirms that. The judiciary situation, now remember, she's 50 years old. The situation then as now was that you were supposed to become a judge right out of law school, and you were supposed to be formed by your superiors. And one can only imagine what they thought of a 50-year-old single woman who had never been trained in criminal law except at Nuremberg, who had not been a criminal law practitioner, coming in, and of course they give her the juvenile job, right? Because she's a woman, and that's where women were put in the judiciary in many countries when the judiciary opened. But then she has the audacity to suggest that they should treat the children differently in keeping with new ideas about child psychology. It's no surprise at all that there would have been a conflict. They couldn't have been happy to receive her in the first place. And hers by that time was not a personality that was going to be subservient, if you will, to superiors. She was quite willing, apparently, to speak her mind. So I don't think that it was, I don't get a sense that it was a happy position, although the status was nice. Her nephew remembers going, she ends up in Dieppe eventually. Back to the place of her birth is the last place she was a judge. And he goes as a young teenager to meet this, who had grown up in the United States, to meet this legendary French judge aunt of his. And he goes to stay with her, and she's the judge in the robes and very impressive, and in fact got to slam a champagne bottle to christen a ship at the port of Dieppe while he was there. And so he has just these incredible ideas of how important she was. She was also a bit inaccessible, he said. Some of the other aunts were much more fun than she was, and maybe that had something to do with her judicial career as well. On Sophie, the gender approach, I think we have to do this, right? I should say there are so many stories that are apparent to me through this research that could be told about Nuremberg. Jews at Nuremberg would be an amazing investigation. If you talk to Ben Ferenz, he will tell you it didn't matter that he was Jewish. The official line was, the American line was not to have too many Jewish people on staff, certainly not in significant positions. If you were a high-ranking Jew on staff, as Ferenz gets to be, you had to rise above that, if you will, because they did not want the project to be characterized as a revenge project. The prejudices that people had, much of elite society, certainly in Anglo-America, was pretty anti-Semitic. They don't lose that because of the Holocaust. They think that the atrocities were bad, but they don't lose their prejudices. And that plays out in both directions. I think there was a lot of, Edith Simon is one of my subjects. She is a Jewish woman, and her circle as an analyst translator at Nuremberg is almost exclusively other Jewish people, right? And what they do in their spare time is go to Jewish DP camps to work with the children. Not many of the Christians were doing that, right? So that's one experience. The other one that I think is just screaming to be written is blacks at Nuremberg. There was a black contingent of GIs and WACs, particularly in the later trials. And throughout much of the record, there are references to this in many different ways. There's a change in their status. The American Army desegregates toward the end of the Nuremberg project, so their status changes in a very real way. Many of the black GIs are dating German women, white women. That is a cause of friction in many different directions. There is a British translator who, in her oral history many years later, says the only GIs that we would have anything to do with were blacks because they were the only ones who had any discipline. The white American GIs had the privilege of going crazy and not really being punished for it. The blacks were highly policed. So I think that there's probably something about that, particularly in the frame of a trial about racism, right? So lots of narratives need to be told. Why is French historiography forgotten, and what can it tell us? I don't know the answer, but of course we know that the Soviet historiography is pretty slim too. I have not yet read Francine Hirsch's book that just came out, but there's not much else other than what she's written in that book and then chapters leading up to the book. Certainly not in English or French. And so relatively inaccessible. There are a couple of other books in French about France at Nuremberg besides the one you mentioned, but none of them is very good. And it suggests to me that there needs to be more work done. I think the Americans just ran the table on the story. You know, think about this. So the US case ends about January. That's halfway through the year-long trial. Jackson leaves. He's not even in Nuremberg most days after that, unless there's a really big courtroom event like his failed cross-examination of Goering. He's off visiting the capitals of Europe, in part because he wants to run for president, apparently. And there's no interest in being in Nuremberg. The British case, there's a little bit more American attention. By the time the French case starts, followed by the Soviet case, not only are the Americans almost gone, except for Thomas Dodd, who cross-examines on behalf of the Americans, they're already firing staff, laying people off because they don't need the same apparatus they had. What Jackson does with many of those people is he has them already preparing what becomes the Red Series on Nazis and the crime of aggression. So the first American official publication about the trial comes out before the trial's over, because in the Americans' mind, the case is pretty much over, right? And then he writes, Telford Taylor writes, lots and lots of the Americans in his contingent, most of whom had had Ivy League degrees, went to law firms that let them take some time to write their books, put out these memoirs that pretty much flood the space of historiography for at least half a generation, right? I mean, there's, you know, Hartley Shawcross, a couple of other people write biographies, but nothing compares. I mean, even the jailer, the American jailer at Nuremberg, I think wrote 2 memoirs, right? They just flood the space. And so France definitely needs to be investigated, but other aspects do as well. What can we learn from letters and postcards? Obviously, an awful lot. The problem is, and this was George's allusion as well, it's indeterminate. It is sometimes tantalizing evidence that you have to be very humble about not over determining what it means. And so this is a challenge for me in the writing. I should also note, all the letters were being censored in this period. And so what the family did, the siblings would write letters to all, or even if they wrote to one sibling, they would do it knowing that that letter would be routed to the entire family over the course of several months. That meant some of the letters were going in and out of occupied areas, or even America was censoring information. At that point, the Office of War Information was doing censorship. And so that's going to make it even harder to get candid observations about public affairs, because they're often writing almost in code and allusions to things. And so that makes it more of a challenge. And then the last thing about sovereignty and colonialism, I'm sorry, George, that this needs more development as well. I think Engi's book is the place you have to start, given what people look at. I love Menton's work, but honestly, they're only writing about Anglo-American imperialism. And so I'm now starting to turn to some books that are going to give me more of a French story. There's one called, and this goes very much with the corporeal, so if I keep that, this book I think will be very important, La colonisation du corps, and it's about Vietnam, the colonization of the body in Vietnam. And that may be the entry point into that. And I do need to work with, as I said, I've read through her 43 lectures in Ottawa, and I found stuff there. I have not got to the point where I've reduced it to a narrative that I'm comfortable telling you how her ideas evolved over time. However, having read them, I do believe they have, and that can be committed to a narrative at some point. That's it for me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Diane. We have other questions, but I think that we will end our session today. George, do you have another comments?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Diane. Excellent paper. Thank you for the discussion.
Thank you. I really appreciate your comments, all of you, and it's just wonderful to have so many people here who are doing work in this area, because it allows one to talk about it at a level that you don't often get to in other kinds of presentations. So I really appreciate that.
Okay, so I'm answering at the same time the questions. Yeah, thank you very much, Diane and George, for their presentation. I think that we should push forward this research on gender approach to international law, women's clubs, and also it would be very interesting, I think, to look also at the women of the lawyers, or the how did they met, or how did they stay at home, or how did they, because when we look, for example, at different lawyers, it's very interesting. For sometimes they were abroad and then they suffered from the situation, but they have also an understanding of certain crimes against peace, and they discuss it among them. So yeah, so while I was working, I had the chance to meet with a lot of wives of lawyers, and it's interesting to see how they interact and what their perception also on international law or on the career of, and it tells another story which should be written. So when we look at Vietnam, it's taking the sources in Vietnamese also on the French. Yeah, on the French. On the French.
If I could interject there, one of the best memoirs about Dalat is written by a Vietnamese woman who was at the convent school when Chalufour was teaching there, and then goes on to be a leader in the liberation movement, an actual soldier in Ho Chi Minh's army. And so she writes a wonderful book about the ironies of where she started and where she ended up. So there are some, now of course, she had been educated in French, so she was able to write a book that was accessible to people who can't speak Vietnamese, right? But there are definitely some voices out there that are well worth listening to.
Okay, yeah, so thank you all of you for being here today, tonight or today. Next week we will have a very interesting also session on the imperial's origin of international law, and we will have 2 speakers and 1 commentator. So the speakers is Andrew Levides and Adam Knapp. So Andrew is fellow at Cambridge. Adam is a PhD student at Harvard, and the commentator will be Boyd van Dijk, and he is a lecturer at Amsterdam. And so this for next week, and it will be at again 3 p.m. in the US, so in Boston or in Athens in Georgia, and it will be 9 p.m. here in Europe, so or 8 p.m. in London. So now I know. Looking forward seeing you all next week, and once again I will send you the link and the password per email. So have a good evening. Thank you for all.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Yeah. Good night, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye. Salut. Hey, okay, I just stop it here. Okay, just a private remark. Guillaume, did you finish chapter 4 and 5?
Fast. I'm still almost finished.
Okay.
But okay.
You send it to it. Okay, I'm translating Guillaume's book into English. So okay, so thanks, George, for being here tonight. I hope you will come here back next week. And then, wishing you all a good evening. Yeah, bye. Guillaume, t'as quelque chose à me dire?
Oui, non, je disais que j'ai presque fini, mais j'ai pris un peu de temps. Là, c'était un petit peu difficile, la période avec les enfants et tout ça. Enfin, bon, bref. Et donc, je pense que pour toi, c'est pareil aussi.
Écoute. Ok. Oh, ouais, c'est un peu compliqué.
C'est un peu compliqué. Mais voilà, donc ça prend un peu de temps. On dit rien de confidentiel, sauf qu'on le dit en français.
Il y a plein de gens qui savent parler le français ici.
Oui, d'accord. Mais c'est pas grave. Voilà, donc j'ai presque fini et je t'écris.
Okay,
en tout cas, merci.
Bon, sinon, on s'appelle. Et elle est bien faite la traduction.
Alors, il y a plusieurs points que j'aimerais discuter, quoi, en fait. Des notions, des expressions, mais dans l'ensemble, ça me paraît aller. Après, c'est des détails plutôt.
Ouais, la première phrase, elle est beaucoup trop longue.
La première phrase, elle est trop longue. Le titre aussi, je ne suis pas sûr du titre du chapitre 4. Je ne sais pas si ça convient en fait comme traduction. Mais enfin, bon, je ferai la liste de tout. Et en fait, je vais t'appeler pour en discuter, c'est le plus simple.
Ça marche.
Ça te va?
Ouais, très bien. Ouais, nickel. Très bien. Bon, bah, du coup, bonne soirée. Et on s'appelle quand, du coup? On s'appelle la semaine prochaine?
Ouais, tout à fait. Merci en tout cas pour ce séminaire. C'est super intéressant, quoi. Super.
Bonne soirée. Au revoir.
Salut. Au revoir.